Hello there, my name is Dr. Gary Marriner and I'm a senior archaeologist at the Sydney-based historical archaeology consultancy Casey and Lowe, and before that I successfully completed my PhD up at UNE under the supervision of Peter Grave and Melanie Filios. And it's regarding this PhD that I've come to talk to you today, specifically about my PhD research which focused on ceramic production in Angkor in Cambodia. Now my thesis was entitled Angkor and the Irrational: Craft Production in a Pre-Modern Southeast Asian Polity. And the irrational part of the research that I was interested in was there were lots of things about ceramic production in Cambodia that just didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. For example, Angkorian ceramics never found outside of the area of Angkor itself, seemingly never traded externally, unlike contemporaneous Chinese, Thai and Vietnamese ceramics. Likewise, there were huge amounts of ceramics produced, but they didn't really seem to play a significant role in society. And the most irrational thing at all was there seemed to be no understanding of the control and systems behind ceramic production. And that's what I really got interested in examining. Now, in order to do that, it was first necessary to understand when ceramics were being produced. But more importantly than just when things began to change. And to examine change successfully, you need to know when things occurred. The most successful way to determine how old something is to know when it was produced. If you rely solely on when something was used or when it was discarded, then there always exists the possibility of things surviving in a system for a lot longer than you realise. Now, the current ceramic typochronology for Cambodia, as most chronological sequences and typological sequences are, was based on when pottery was consumed or discarded, however, because that's what it's found mostly. Now in Cambodia, that was particularly important because a large amount of the ceramics so far studied have come from monumental sites, and these monumental sites are dated from the day they first opened. They normally have inscription dates that have been found and studied, and that date is used to say that that is when the ceramics date from. Now that creates a typochronology which can then be applied to other sites elsewhere and used as a proxy dating tool. And of course, that further exacerbates a potential error and makes sure that dating gets essentially worse and worse. Now, that's not to say that this kind of approach is negative or bad, it's just that we now possess the tools to further refine and really increase the precision and accuracy of chronologies. We should continue to use ceramics as much as possible as proxy dating tools because they're low cost, they're low investment, and they're ideal for both projects and places that have very little funding that maybe can't afford widespread radiometric or other scientific dating methods. The use of proxies are fantastic. But if we're going to do it, we need to make sure we can do it as precisely as possible. Another side of examining production is the ability to learn about the society behind production. One that creates, one that exchanges, and one that consumes a product. Every single artifact, every single item, including those in our own lives, has a rich and complex history. All the way from original resource procurement, concept, design, innovation, and invention, ultimately manufacturing, trade and exchange, primary use, potential secondary uses for objects, heirlooming if things become important to us, and ultimately the discard of an object either because it breaks or because we come up with some other crazy reason to bury it in the ground. The craft production approach that I undertook during my research allowed me to examine the political, social, and economic functionings of the Angkorian state. I considered all three of these facets in depth, but due to the nature of my research and the nature of the data I generated, ultimately it was the political and secondarily the economic control that shone through most through my research. But there were crucial ideas that came to the fore about social possible relationships that I would like to investigate further in the future. So what exactly did I do? Well, I undertook new excavations, multiple kilns, across 3 different kiln complexes and smaller excavations elsewhere, working with a huge variety of teams. Primarily, I worked with Dr. Idarit and Irrational from the Apsar Authority in Cambodia. I also worked with Dr. Pong Kasaka from the Royal Academy of Arts of Cambodia, as well as working with other teams from other universities and research centres from across the world. In addition to these new excavations, I undertook a re-examination in detail of all previously excavated Cambodian kilns and Angkorian period kilns found elsewhere, such as in Thailand. And I did this down to the best level of detail I possibly could, given the publications, including the recording of extensive kiln metrics, that is the shape and size and layout of the kilns, the organisation and distribution of sites, as well as examining all radiocarbon data published for Angkor in Cambodia and recalibrating those, and examining as many different lines of evidence as I could. I also undertook dialytometric analysis to interpret original firing temperatures and OSL dating, but they're to talk about another time. In order to understand all this evidence that I generated, I adopted a craft production approach. At its core, craft production is a human activity, at least as defined by Costin in her 2001 work, which, thanks to us archaeologists, results in the creation of a physical product that we can then study. As a human activity, craft production is integrated into the lives of agents who participate within the system, primarily the artisans who produce objects, but also multiple others in related and overlapping economic and social spheres, including, like with the life history of an object, people like merchants, people that mine and procure resources, consumers. It's unsurprising, therefore, given this scope and complexity, the multiple definitions of craft production have been used over the years. In very general terms, craft production refers to the manufacturing of items such as ceramics, stone objects, textiles, metals, that's performed by human agents without a reliance on standardizing machinery. And that non-reliance on machinery is quite critical. Whilst production itself is a relatively straightforward concept to define, it's the creation or manufacturing of something, the craft part of craft production is a little bit more ambiguous. And I follow the view of Kathy Costin again here in my research. And in her 2005 publication, it was defined as any transformational process involving skill, aesthetics, and cultural meaning. So there are many concepts to craft production, and I focused generally on four in particular in order to understand the economic, political, and social structuring of the state behind the production complexes. Till fairly recently, most discussions around craft production focused on whether or not it was specialised. And this was a large result thanks to Gordon Childe, who in 1950 realised that as a result of the differentiation of production tasks within society, it leads to a system of mutual dependence, whereby certain members of a society could be freed from mere subsistence procurement to engage in a different form of full-time production. Essentially, Childe recognised that once we no longer need to be full-time farmers, we can become full-time something else. This was expanded in 1978 by Evans, who accounted for the first time for part-time production, accepting that those who engage in craft specialisation may only do so occasionally, and argues that an increase in specialisation led to the creation of a strata of society which no longer engaged in any kind of subsistence procurement, which created labour specialisations and intensification. A more nuanced approach that recognised for the first time that specialists may not be full-time was proposed by Stark in 1991, and realised that specialisation may instead reflect a multitude of organisational structures. And this was based on research into the ethnographic record. More recently again, Flad and Herbie in 2007 recognised the distinction on the one hand between producer specialisation and on the other between product specialisation. The idea being that a specialised producer focuses only on a single object and works entirely on creating that object, whereas product specialisation was focused on the idea that multiple different people who may not have to be specialists can come together to create what appears to be a specialised product. The second key concept that I focused on was the context of production. The concepts of attached and independent production, which define what the context of production is, are widely used in assessments of craft production, and they were first established by Earl in 1981 in an attempt to model what specialised production looked like. In its briefest form, attached producers are people who work for someone else, whereas independent producers do not. When examining the context of production and whether or not production is attached or independent, the key issues are control of the system and power over the goods that are produced. In attached context, control of production and power over goods is retained by an external force to the producer. In independent context, the reverse is true. Now, as ever, dichotomies fall down, and there exists the possibility for context whereby separation exists between systematic control and the goodly power. For example, situations where producers may be free to create, innovate and produce, but a proportion or indeed all of their goods are given over to elites. Now, this kind of system can be coercive, i.e. taxation, tribute or slavery, or it can be voluntary, through donation or gifting. And in the instances where it is voluntary, there would be a benefit to the producer for their participation in the system. This could be in the form of material compensation, so they get paid for what they produce, either in money or in goods, or it could be spiritual well-being. So they may donate items to a temple whereby their souls are looked after in the afterlife, or indeed in the forming of social relationships, where gifts are given to other people to build those kinds of bonds. Now, we already know from previous research that Angkor was a stratified society, and that means that the conditions for attachment exist. But as we've said, the traditional dichotomy between attached on the one hand and independent on the other is a massive oversimplification. And in reality, multiple other circumstances can exist, and it should be seen more as a spectrum than as a pure dichotomy. For example, Ames in 1995 argues for embedded production, which is when you have intensified elite household production, whereby the people who control the system are actually those that make it. So how do we look at the context of production? Well, primarily through where production facilities are located. Either within or in the immediate proximity of elite centres, we think of attached production. When we look at the distribution of production centres throughout a settlement, it's considered to be more indicative of independent production. It's also important to consider the organisation of the production spaces themselves, specifically associated areas like habitation, workshops. What kind of conditions do we have for producers? The next thing I examined was the intensity of production. Is it full or part-time? As with examinations of specialisation, intensity is classified in terms of the amount of time a producer dedicates to craft production. It's proposed that there is an implied connection between full-time and specialised production, such as suggested by Clark and Parry in 1990, but this is insufficient as a definition, as it removes the potential for part-time specialists. Ceramic production is a complex, multi-phase task, which does require input from a variety of individuals, and as such, it's possible to have a full-time system of production without specialisation, but with enough agents within the system operating that none of them actually need to be full-time themselves. The potters who make the vessels, the guys who operate the kilns, the designers, the conceptors, the procurers, none of these people need to be full-time for there to be full-time ceramic production. As usual, the dichotomy has fallen down and various alternatives have been proposed. Hearth in 2009 came up with the idea of intermittent crafting, being defined as a discontinuous or periodic craft production, and that seems to be a fairly good model for what we're looking at. There's also the idea of multi-crafting, where people can be full-time craftspeople, but they don't spend all their time working on a single craft, such as pottery or weaving, and they dip in and out of various other activities. So to examine the intensity of production, we look at things like the volume of tools, workshop spaces, and sufficient demand for full-time production. Or is there not sufficient demand and we only need part-time production because people don't need the goods? Variability in product is a key marker of whether or not a producer is seen as being full-time or part-time. As the idea being that the more full-time you are, the more skills you have, therefore you look at less variability. And finally, to examine the social side of things, we look at the relationships of production. Craft production systems incorporate multiple aspects of a society, as we've said. People like designers, producers, controllers, traders, and consumers. And it's important to remember at all times that these are people. Technology encompasses tool creation and use, but it's the people behind it that operate the system. Objects are things used in production, and products, traded goods, raw materials, and consumables all exist, while networks may translate into procurement of resources and these consumables, subsistence support for producers, trade and exchange networks, and elite and closed systems of exchange. Ultimately, the craft production approach allows us to reconstruct pathways of objects that run through multiple strata of society and individual agents, often made of multiple modified materials that are created via several technological processes, and that function within and as a contributor for multiple networks. It is always important to remember that products can embody multiple human concepts and relationships, including gender, power, status, and others. Of course, when we think of Angkor, we most famously think of hidden temples lost in the jungle, such as the Firmanikias on the left here, and Tapram, the famous Tomb Raider jungle, on the right. And indeed, it was these kind of wonderful, slightly outdated ideas now of adventurous archaeology through the jungle that really first got me interested in Angkor. As you can see from the map here, Angkor is a relatively widespread polity, and critically, it's a polity of centres. Each of the stars, named stars on the map there, represents a regional centre that we know about, and the red lines in between are actually highways that linked these centres up in the past. The Angkorian state was traditionally founded in 802 CE by Jayavarman II, who instructed a priest named Hiryadama to perform a ritual on Mount Mandriya, now known as Kulen Mountain, to protect Kamboja from any outside influences, specifically Java. The first capital was established at Hariharalaya, which is now known as the Buddhist group, by Jayavarman II. And following his death, a brief but fierce power struggle occurred that led to the relocation of the capital from Hariharalaya to what we now call central Angkor. Down off the mountain and on the plains, great cities were eventually created. First, around the area that we now know as the Buddhist group, and this remained the capital during the reign of Yasovarman I, and following the death of his successor, Yasovarman II, the capital relocated north to a place called Kokur, which is around 100 kilometers northeast of Angkor. However, this relocation was short-lived, and following the death of Yasovarman II in 942, Rajendra Varman I seized power and relocated the capital city back to Angkor, but not to Hariharalaya. Instead, he created it to the northwest and created a new capital city. Following a violent struggle, his son gained power around 968 and constructed multiple new temples. At the dawn of the second millennium, a civil war took place that saw three competing rulers, all struggling for control, with some based out of Angkor and others based out of Kokur. Eventually, Yasovarman I won this civil war and built the first fortified palace, the Royal Palace of Angkor Thom, as well as other smaller temples. And he initiated the construction of the West Barai, which eventually became a 5-kilometre long water reservoir. In addition to the stuff around Angkor, he was one of the first to start building temples elsewhere, including at Phnom Chisor, 270 kilometres southeast of Angkor, and Preah Vihear, which we can see up on the map here, up to the northeast. His successor, Udayadaya Titavarman, who reigned from 1050 to 1066, had a troubled reign with multiple rebellions, but also continued this monumental construction. In the early 12th century, a ruler came to the throne by the name of Yasovarman II, who constructed a major new temple complex around Angkor Wat, Cambodia's most famous temple that you can see on the bottom of the slide, on the national flag, and in pretty much every photo of Cambodia. Yasovarman II was responsible for great expansions in territory of the state, including annexing the Cham territory and extending the borders to the northwest and south. Following his death, Yasovarman II, his successor, built another new capital city at Preah Khan to the north of Angkor Thom. And following his death, very little is known over the next few rulers, other than they seem to have built no more new temples for a while. Eventually, in around 1181, Angkor's most famous king, Jayavarman VII, ascended the throne. And he was a prolific builder. He rebuilt many of the temples that already existed and built many, many more across the country. He shored up the road network, he built rest stops, bridges, hospitals, all sorts of other things. But following his death around 1220 CE, Angkor went into what is now seen as a terminal decline. Critically, it collapsed, but it never disappeared entirely, and the areas that were considered by the French to be lost were never fully depopulated. What all this political upheaval in a relatively short period of time has done has left behind an extensive and frankly beautiful monumental architecture, and it's no wonder that it's a focus of so much study. In Angkor in Cambodia, the traditional sources of evidence, such as art, epigraphy, and monumental architecture, are insufficient, however, for examining craft production, as there are very few references to material culture in, for example, inscriptions or in the artworks engraved in temples. Where they do exist, they're generally lists of items that have been gifted to a temple. Most of the epigraphic history is inherently biased towards individual elites, basically the people to whom the inscriptions are dedicated, or the people who commission inscriptions, and they lack detail regarding many aspects of the functioning of the state, such as control over the economy. So these were part of the things I wanted to address, and in doing so, I conducted new fieldwork. Specifically, I excavated right down at the very bottom of that map at a site called Chevng, also at sites called Bakong, Khnar Po, Tani, and Veal Svay in the area, which hopefully I can highlight just here, with Chevng being down at the bottom there. And once I get this to work, so you can see on this map a bit clearer that I focused most of my research on the area to the east of Angkor, at Bakong down here, Khnar Po, and some small work at Tani, as well as excavations at Veal Svay here on the east road to Bakong Khnar Po. New excavations were undertaken at 3 complexes within Cambodia with multiple kilns excavated at each site. The first 2 complexes, Bakong and Khnar Po, are situated in the regions to the east of Angkor, north of the rulers group down here, the original capital once they came down off the mountain. And this region of production is characterized as the East Angkor group. 4 kilns were excavated at Bakong, 3 at Khnar Po, and 3 down south at Chevng. In addition, test pits were dug at the surrounds of each kiln to recover wasters and examine specific technological and morphological questions. To ensure the temporary changing nature of the production system to be addressed, a large focus was placed on the recovery of samples for absolute dating from each kiln, with charred organics recovered for radiocarbon dating and sediments for OSL dating, as well as providing overarching data to address the organisation of craft production. These excavations focused on three key but poorly understood issues. First, what impact does dating multiple kilns from within the same complex have on existing sequences? Secondly, does the evidence suggest the prospect of multiple intra- and intersite complexes operating simultaneously? And if so, what are the resulting implications? And 3, is there any evidence for change and variation in production over time? So here you can see 4 of the kilns I excavated, 2 from Bakong 14 and Bakong 18, and 2 from Khnar Po, from Khnar Po A6 and A11. These work was undertaken with my good friend and colleague Irrational and his team from the Apsara Authority, with my primary role on site co-directing with him in addition to recovering the scientific samples. At Bakong, 4 new kilns in total were excavated to get a better understanding of the nature of a technology. Bakong has been proposed to be the oldest kiln site in Cambodia, or at least the oldest of the Angkorian period. And it was really important to get a grasp and a good understanding of what technology looked like at this early stage. The kilns excavated were Bakong 11, which sits in a high mound, 9 separate reconstruction episodes for that kiln, but it had been badly damaged by looting. But in a way, this kind of helped us because it meant that there was less preservation to worry about, and we could do things like remove floors and have a better look. Kilns 14 and 18 were close together and both very similar, low-lying on just very, very shallow mounds, and each had 2 floors, small square fireboxes, which is the area of the kiln at the front here, and each had a single column of pillars through the centre. Bakong 26, which we also excavated, was heavily damaged by land clearance, but did show similar fireboxes. We excavated 43 2x1 metre trenches alongside the kilns, and we recovered 1,450 kilograms of ceramic material that the students from the Royal University of Fine Arts in Cambodia are currently still going through years later. At Khnar Po, we excavated 3 new kilns, again to understand the complex better, and Khnar Po is being suggested is after Bakong, but a similar sort of period. There we also half-sectioned the kilns rather than fully excavating them to save time, but also to help preserve them, as Khnar Po is an active village, and indeed both A6 and A11 were actually the gardens of people. Kiln A6 showed an increasingly standardised form of production, with again, we see fireboxes at the base and a single line of pillars through the centre of the kiln. A11 was a very similar size and shape to A6, and indeed they were only located around 30 metres away. Kiln C3, which we also excavated, was unfortunately severely damaged and we couldn't get too much from it. But in total, 11 trenches were excavated, producing 603 kilograms of ceramics. Generally, there was a small amount of technical variation, but on the whole, we would characterise all of the kilns excavated from Bakong and Khnar Po as being part of the same technology. The ceramics, as I say, are still under study, but largely the assemblage consisted of unglazed stonewares, green glazed stonewares, and a glaze called lit de vin, which is the colour of red wine. Down south at Chevng, again, we excavated 3 kilns, and these 3 were contiguous. Now, Chevng is around 250 kilometres south of the central Angkor region, on the outskirts of the current capital city, Phnom Penh, and is most closely linked to the pre-Angkorian city of Angkor Wat, which is 50 kilometres to the south. It is a huge complex with 67 kilns currently identified. But in reality, there are probably many, many more. The problem is the urban sprawl of Phnom Penh has destroyed and built over many of these. There is also, sadly, the killing fields nearby, which is now, and rightly so, a sacred monument which can never really be investigated. In addition to the 67 kilns, 11 temple foundations have been found in the area and 26 habitation mounds. The 3 contiguous kilns that we investigated were curious. They all seem to identify very similar technological characteristics to those up in the east of Angkor, specifically the square fireboxes and the central line of pillars, which was present in all 3 of the kilns we looked at. However, they were much, much larger, and the fact there were 3 that shared walls on a single kiln was unusual. As said earlier, we also looked at a few other sites, and specifically, we looked at the site of Veal, Svay, which also, again, exhibited very, very similar characteristics, despite being in a different location, this time along the East Road. So, as I said briefly in the introduction, my key methods through this research followed 3 themes: comprehensive study of previous literature to extract data, excavations, and the examination of kilns and their complexes. Then there was the application of chronological and analytical techniques to contextualise and characterise production. For this study, 10 kilns across 3 separate complexes were excavated, documented and sampled, and 2 other previously excavated kilns were re-examined, and I took OSL samples from them, and the OSL will not feature in this talk. From the published data, I was able to extract the metrics of a further 16 kilns, giving me a total of 26 kilns that had reliable data. To assess design characteristics in terms of stability and innovation, key analogous metrics were compared across all of the kiln sites. I've managed to produce 20 new conventional radiocarbon ages that I was able to calibrate, which have helped shape the understanding of the chronology of production. I also undertook an estimation of the operating temperature of kilns from a kiln at Bakong and a kiln at Veal Svay, and noticed a difference in firing temperature, between the two sites. My research generated this fairly simple looking ox-cow plot of modelled radiocarbon dates, which clearly demonstrates a temporal separation between production at these sites and production at these sites, which I go on to call stage 1 on the left and stage 2 on the right. This clear temporal separation was originally suggested by my colleague Ida in a 2010 paper, and I was very pleased to be able to provide some scientific backing to his idea. Stage 1 production occurs in East Angkor, at the sites of Bakong, Tani, Khnar Po, as well as Chevng to the south. Stage 2 production, however, occurs exclusively along the East Road at the sites of Veal Svay, as well as other sites such as Torp Chain. In stage 1, production continued in the area beyond the 10th century date, which was originally proposed by Ida as being the end of stage 1 production. By examining the ceramic material, seems to be a change in glazing and forms between the 10th and the 12th century CE. But the technology of kiln production does not show the same change during phase 1. My colleague De Rit also suggested that phase 2 occurs south at Chevng in Phnom Penh, which I was able to demonstrate was not the case. What this research does provide, however, is a very firm chronological backing for the eventual analysis of ceramics, which is ongoing, as I said. So, what does phase 1 production look like in terms of craft production? All kilns within phase 1 utilise a cross-draft technology and often feature pillars in the firing chamber and vents in the fireboxes, although this is not the case everywhere and variation does exist. No exhaust system has been found for any kiln yet, so we can't really compare those between the different sites. Similar technology is utilised in all groups that we examined, that we've assigned to phase 1, including those in Burian province in Thailand, which unfortunately are very poorly recorded or presented. Occasionally, a common pattern was borne out through the chronology of the sites as well. This is that we start off with 1 or 2 kilns being operated in the early period, normally up until around the 10th century, and then a huge expansion during the 11th and 12th century, where it seems that every one of the 39 kilns at Bakong may have been operational simultaneously, or at least all of the ones we looked at so far were. And then production abruptly ceases at the early 13th century. At Bakong, all of the kilns, apart from Bakong 11, which we said was reconstructed 9 times, are built on low mounds. In total, the complex forms a linear spread, around 500 metres wide and about 1.5 kilometres long, along the west bank of the Rulas River, on flat land that's generally these days used for small-scale growing. This low-level agriculture and lack of modern construction means that the preservation potential there is very high. The nearest temple is the Temple of Lolai in the Rulas group, the early capital, which is around 3 kilometres to the south, and whilst no direct major road is known, it's likely that the site would have been on a local road from, down to this temple core. Khnar Po, 19 kilns have been identified, which are separated into 4 separate groups. 2 of the groups, A and C, are built on the banks of a barai or water reservoir, and the other 2 are built on flat plains very similar to Bakong. In total, the site area measures around 1 kilometre square. The nearest temple located to Khnar Po is the temple of Chao Sri Veal, which is around 5 kilometres to the northwest. Phase 2 production, however, is limited in both time and space to the 6 complexes that are located on the East Road between the Angkorian core and the iron-producing temple of Priya Khan of Kampong Svay. This is in stark contrast to the production at the height of phase one, which at its height in the 11th and 12th century was found across the territory of modern Cambodia and elsewhere. The organisation of production complexes in phase two are very different as well. There are many fewer kilns, with an average of just 6 and the maximum of only 15 at Torp Chai. And the 6 complexes are very closely packed together in just a 4.5 kilometre spread. And they are located almost adjacent to the ancient road that runs between Angkor and Premodern Svay. Rather than be located in the relative proximity of major temples, they're all located near smaller rest houses or religious sites. For example, Torp Chai takes its name from Prasat Torp Chai, which was constructed by Jayavarman VII in the 12th century. They are 10 kilometres east of a temple called Ben Mila, which has been suggested was very important for distributing resources, as it's on the junction of the East Road and the Northeast Road. It may also be the case that the ceramics being produced during phase two on the East Road was sent here for redistribution. Critically, the technology is very different during phase two. During phase two, there is a lot more innovation and change in kiln design. For example, at Torp Chai, 3 secondary fire trenches were found, which separates the firing chamber into 4 separate sections. The kiln is also 21 metres long, which is the longest kiln so far discovered in Southeast Asia. Uniquely, part of the exhaust system here were partially preserved and consisted of 3 openings at the far end of the kiln. At another site within the East Road group, Chong Sam Rong, a secondary fire trench was located halfway through the firing temperature, where fuel could have been fed into the sides. It was also suggested that the firebox of this kiln was trapezoidal. However, this appears to be an error in recording. Veal's fire, the kiln site I investigated in the East Road group, however, displayed very similar technological characteristics to those during phase one, suggesting that whilst technology was changing, there was some legacy left over. The technological divergence found during phase two, in addition to its organisational differences, indicates that there is a fundamental change in Angkorian ceramic industry at this time. The increase in kiln size and decrease in overall number of kilns per complex marks a very different approach to production, and suggests that perhaps there was an attempt to maintain production levels whilst decreasing the overall size of complexes. And this change, I argue, is indicative of a much larger change in society. There's a century between the end of phase one production and the start of phase two production. It's highly unlikely that pots were simply not being made at this time, however. We just haven't found them yet. So, how does this all relate back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, our approaches to craft production? Well, the relative technical homogeneity seen during phase one indicates specialised production, insofar as it shows an idealised form of kilns that all of the different complexes attempt to emulate. The regularity of kiln production, of kiln design and technology, indicates the exertion of control for an external source. Somebody is there to dictate what production should look like. The abundancy and size of complexes towards the end of phase one shows that the production output would have far exceeded the requirements of the producers. And the resource procurement system that supplied the kilns would have had to have been massive. So in order to produce that much pottery and keep the people that are making the pots with enough food for them to eat, enough fuel to fire the kilns, and enough clay to make the pots, I argue there must have been somebody controlling that system. Also, the sheer volume they're making mean there must have been some kind of market. And as producing goods for market means that there is a surplus, surplus means there has to be specialisation. The products made, primarily the green glazed stonewares, are found at sites all across Angkor too, meaning they must have been traded and exchanged in some way, and I argue that due to the hierarchical nature of the society, this trade or exchange must have been controlled. Finally, the location of complexes in phase one close to the key infrastructure means that in both the core and provincial centres, there is evidence that exchange mechanisms exist. During phase 2, despite major changes in the organisation of production, evidence still suggests the existence of specialisation. Specifically, the location of the complexes along the East Road suggests that artisans are operating kilns in areas they know give them access to trade and exchange networks. Again, the products they produce, which this time are primarily brown glazed wares, they're still found at a variety of different type sites, meaning they are still being used in the monumental cores and the urban cores. And it still means there was a surplus being generated. But perhaps the steep decline in the number of complexes overall indicates a reduction in overall production and not a reduction in overall control. So, to look at the context of production, what evidence do we have for attachment? Well, temples would have only been possible, it's argued by Stark in 2015, with centralised control. To build the kind of temples that we see in Angkor and to maintain them, you must have had some kind of centralised control. And as Fletcher et al. Argues in 2015, a temple itself is a demonstration of power. Look at what I can do. Look at how powerful I am. A clear spatial link can be made between workshop, between production location and centres of elite control. As I mentioned earlier with the iron industry, the temple of Premodern of Svay actually has smelting occurring within its walls. And recent research by Bakong Khnar Po from Angkor Thom shows that bronze production was occurring there in the same way. But we don't see that. We don't see that level of control for ceramic production. Yes, they're close to the exchange networks, the roads, but we don't see it directly atop temples. And indeed, as time goes on, production complexes get further and further away from the centre. Bakong, very, very close to Low-Lai and the Rules group. And by the time we get to phase 2, we're a long way from major temples. The lack of overtly symbolic decoration on Angkorian ceramics and their relative ubiquity suggests they don't generally function as elite objects in society. But there is some limited suggestion that they are used for funerary contexts. Epigraphic evidence exists for entire villages being attached to temples, and this may have included some kind of pottery production within villages. So there is definitely some evidence that exists for attachment. Now, the distribution patterns of the Angkorian period ceramics across the entire region strengthen this. There is absolutely almost no examples of Angkorian ceramics being found outside of the Angkorian Empire. On the one hand, this could just simply result from people not wanting them. You had the ceramics of China and Thailand, or Siam as it was, being highly regarded and recognised through to this day and desirable. Indeed, Groslier, one of the pioneering researchers, Groslier, who was one of the pioneering researchers of Angkorian ceramics, quoted once saying, the Khmers did not develop a great ceramic art. But I'd argue, on the other hand, the possibility exists that because of elite control of the distribution of ceramics, their trade to rival polities in the area was prohibited. We saw earlier throughout the history section that there's this great example, there's multiple examples of invasions, conquest, and wars. And perhaps there simply was no desire to trade outside of the boundaries of the empire. There's also the possibility that ceramics did play some kind of ritual role in society that we don't understand yet. And so the elite wanted to maintain these things for themselves. Further evidence for attachment comes from the context of production. Kiln sites are fairly regimented. There's technological homogeneity, and we do have that link to the road network. However, there's also evidence for independent production. The number of kiln complexes overall, and the number of kilns per complex, especially in phase 1, suggests that production by sheer necessity may have had to have been independent. The fewer people involved in the system, the easier it is to control. But what we're looking at in phase 1 is a massive system. And it may have been very difficult for anyone to control that to a point where it was worth controlling. With such large-scale production, then it's possible that the industry and the volume of production created was simply too large to control. Although this does mean that the potential control over the distribution of ceramics was present, just not over the production themselves. And as we said, they're not hypertrophic items, they're not highly decorated and symbolic, which would suggest that they're not intended to be politically valuable and couldn't really be considered prestige goods. So what about intensity of production? Well, the quantity again and scale of production does suggest that it would have had to occur as a full-time process, but there is not necessarily the evidence for full-time artisans. Instead, I'd argue that crafting commences as a seasonal activity, based on a requirement for potters to produce food and on climatic conditions. UNE 1981 produces textual evidence from the Bakong Khnar Po, which demonstrates that in addition to material goods, consumables were a major component of an attached village's donation to a temple. It's unlikely that villagers being attached to temples could produce every item they were expected to donate, as this would manifest itself in dispersed production sites, spread out across multiple settlements, each village having one or two kilns, rather than the seeming dedicated production complexes that we know. So instead, I argue that we have seasonality of production, whereby specialist, but part-time specialist producers made pottery alongside other activities. This would have been similar, I believe, to the kind of arrangement that occurred for Angkor to produce its vast monuments and water hydrological features such as the Barai reservoirs and the canals. Finally, looking at the relationships of production. Now, unfortunately, the current corpus of evidence for craft production doesn't lend itself easily to an assessment of the social identity of producers. The evidence for attachment indicates that the social status of artisans was lower than that of the elite, so we don't have embedded production, but it's difficult to really move too far beyond this. Unfortunately, during the excavations, we found no evidence of any of the domestic side of craft production. There were no workshops, there were no houses, so further research needs to be undertaken to examine this. That said, I would like to propose a few ideas that would require further investigation. The standardization of both product and technology during phase one could suggest a unified social identity amongst potters, as all artisans who were sharing a common perception of the industry. They may have shared a common identity. Likewise, during phase one, within each complex, it's common for kilns to be organized into clustered groups. This may not have been a purely utilitarian decision based on pre-existing conditions, as the influencing factors, such as the presence of pre-existing earthworks, was rarely utilised to their maximum potential. At Khnar Po, for example, groups A and C, the ones we investigated, were both constructed on the banks of the Barai, which contains a large amount of unused space. Despite this large amount of unused space, groups B and D were constructed as they were at Bakong on the low, nearby flat floodplain. And the possibility exists that these groups could relate to an internal division within the potting community, perhaps based on social identity or kinship, with each kin group utilising their own group of kilns within a complex. And you start to get very complex when you talk about kin and kilns. So what do we see? Primarily a parallel between pots and power. I won't go through the entire history of Angkor again, but needless to say, that when we start to see a fully formed technology of ceramic production in the 8th century, it emerges with the empire. As Yayavarman II is controlling, consolidating the empire, so we see the flourishing of the ceramic industry. Throughout phase one, we see a general steady growth in ceramic production that at times is indifferent to the changing role of politics, and at other times matches it quite closely. Finally, in the golden age, as it were, during the 12th century, there is a massive growth in the ceramic industry, with production centres cropping up all across the state. Following the decline after the reign of Yayavarman VII, we have our gaffing production, and then phase two begins in the 14th century, when there appears to be no real royal power or no epigraphic record of it. The patterns of control are mirrored in changes to the ceramic industry when focusing on the constitution of ceramic production. So, to characterise production then. During phase one, production can be contextualised as intermittent producer specialisation, as evidenced by the organisation of production. The relative technical homogeneity found at the East Angkor complexes, especially during the earliest period of production, indicates that the kilns were optimised to produce a surplus. This optimization likely came about as a result of the establishment of complexes by elite command. In the initial period, complexes were small and as such were easier to control. The East Angkor group is not located on a major road, but due to its proximity to the core, control would have been relatively easy to exert. The growth and expansion of cities and the state generally increased the demand for ceramics, which subsequently caused an increase in production. As the scale of production increases, so does the difficulty in control. During this period of increased demand and production, the degree and nature of control changes. The direct control over production decreases, whereas the control over the products and their distribution is either maintained or even potentially does increase. The establishment of production complexes on major roads suggests that during phase 2, demand for products grew in all areas, and the need to transport goods efficiently was prioritised over the ability to directly control production. The investigation of resource procurement is another avenue of research that would really help with this. That does raise the question, of course, as to why elite allow control of ceramic production to be lessened whilst maintaining direct control of other crafts. Perhaps it's simply that ceramics themselves weren't important enough to the elites. They weren't valuable enough to warrant bothering with control. We know from excavations that ceramics were used in huge quantities, but maybe they were seen more as a disposable thing you didn't need to worry about. And that leads on to a kind of related second idea, that they were intended to be general commodities and that their exchange wasn't significant. So not only the products themselves weren't important, so the trade and exchange of them just didn't need controlling. This really comes to the fore during phase 2, where the potential for control over the product remains, as shown by the proximity of production to roads, but there's unlikely to have been any direct control over the industry at this time. Simply, there is too much variation in site technology to have the idea that there is somebody dictating how it should happen. And I think today we're going to leave it there. I hope you didn't find that too dry, and I'll leave you, of course, with the glorious image of Angkor Wat at sunrise. I'd like to thank everyone that's contributed to this research and helped out. And I understand that if you're watching this as part of the UNE Archaeology Society, we're going to be having a questions and answer session during the intensive school. So please do get registered with that, get involved. It would be great to speak to you all. And I hope you've really enjoyed my talk today. So yeah, as I say, any questions, by all means, do join the Archaeology Society talk. And if for whatever reason you're watching this and you're not part of the Archaeology Society, do feel free to contact me at Twitter. My handle's on the first page, and we can, I'll happily fill any questions there. Thank you very much for watching.